Hi everyone, welcome to the Pride in STEM live discussion, where today we are going to be sort of rounding up some of the discussions that we've had in the podcast episodes that we've had this week. So if you've been listening to our podcast, we have been able to discuss some of the barriers that are faced with by individuals who identify within the LGBTQ plus community. And today's aim is to kind of provide some practical solutions, so then that way it will then allow you to then work out what you can do on an individualistic basis, whilst also trying to get your organizations to get a bit better. So we have some of our wonderful panelists who have been part of this discussion this week. And rather than me trying to basically go around and introduce everybody one by one, I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves. So I'm just going to go in the order of my screen. Avery, would you like to go first?
Hi. So I'm Avery. My pronouns are he, him. So I'm just finishing off my master's in nuclear decommissioning and waste management at the University of Birmingham before I'll be starting my PhD in nuclear fusion soon.
Nice. We then got Shapangi next.
Hi, I'm Shapangi. I'm a junior doctor in Dublin and Ireland. I'm also an academic researcher with an interest in psychiatry and inclusive academic editorship. And I'm at the intersection of being a QTI-PSC, a person who has both mental illness and physical disability. And I talk about inclusion from a variety of perspectives in terms of how we serve our patients as well as ourselves.
Nice. Next, we have Nushat.
Hi, I'm Nushat Tabassum. My background is in geology. So I previously did a PhD in inclusions trapped in diamonds and what they can tell us about the Earth's interior. And during my time in academia, I found how exclusionary academia and science research could be. So I wanted to take some time to explore ways that we could make STEM and research more inclusive. So currently, I am leading a 9-month pilot project in trying to encourage ethnic minorities to pursue careers and opportunities in natural history.
Nice. Next, we then have Rob.
Hi, I'm Rob. I am a software engineer in the rail industry. I also go by Nibbleinks online. So if anyone wants to find me online after this, that's where you can find me. After coming out as demisexual, I now talk about asexuality a lot online and want to raise the profile of asexuality in STEM specifically.
Next, we have Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Cosgriff. I am a science communicator who mainly works with young people and schools, and I tend to have a focus on inclusion schools. One of the things I'm interested in at the moment is LGBTQ plus inclusion in STEM education. I am asexual. I found out around a year ago. And in terms of other identities, I also have mixed backgrounds. So I'm white and Filipino.
Then we have James.
Hi, so I'm James. My pronouns are he, him. I am currently a junior software developer. Not junior software developer. Let's retract that. I'm listening to Rob. My apologies. I'm a junior DevOps engineer. Definitely not the same thing. But I've been working within the tech sector for around about 10 years. Prior to that, I was QA for a number of different businesses. And I have recently just taken over as one of the heads of Tech Council. So looking to try and make that a safe and inclusive space, which I'm really looking forward to. Mainly in the past, I've worked with other groups that try to increase awareness in terms of LGBTQ plus representation within technology.
Thank you. And finally, we have myself. So I am Craig Poku. I go by the pronouns he, they. I am currently a air quality scientist based at the University of York, where I will also go and discuss about intersectionality, the idea of privilege, and ensuring that even if you are within a marginalized group, that you then don't use it to then attack other marginalized people who may fall within the same intersection. So, and also doing a Zoom panel like this, there is no neat way to actually get everybody to kind of introduce themselves. It just feels like I'm just reading off a list. So for those who are actually going to be listening to this, I am very sorry. I tried my best there. So yeah, we're just going to jump straight into discussion. Before I begin, I had some really interesting conversations with you all with regards to the different sort of barriers faced by people within the LGBTQ plus community. And to kickstart our discussion, one of the things that came out was this idea of intersectionality and how trying to capture the intersectional nature can be very challenging within STEM. So I guess my first question, and this is sort of open to the panel, is how do we balance the needs of certain communities within the STEM space?
I'll go first because I think this is probably the hardest question out there. And I'm going to be unhelpful by saying, like, I think this is really difficult and it's just something that I'm still trying to learn because, and I'm still trying to learn it because my identity and how I identify has always been changing. Particularly, like, you know, I was always aware that, like, I'm South Asian, I'm an ethnic minority, but also like coming out as bi when I was older. So like my identity has been evolving, but also even though I identify as South Asian, the older I get, I identify more as like British Bengali as opposed to just British South Asian because the experiences of all South Asian ethnicities are quite different. So like the way I've identified has changed, and that also is also a product of like me realizing like these community spaces, how exclusive they can be in not being like aware of the different layers of marginalization that could happen. And the way I try to navigate like intersectionality is trying to advocate for who is the most marginalized in a group. So like making sure that the person who has the most marginalization is the one that's prioritized in the conversation. And I think when doing this, we also have to be aware that like certain conversations are only applicable and effective in certain spaces. So for example, like when I talk about say homophobia in the South Asian community, I do it within the space of South Asian communities and not in a more public sector where the homophobia in the South Asian community could be used as a weapon for people to express their racism. So like knowing which spaces are really useful to talk about which discussion, but when I'm in those certain spaces, knowing that I'm always advocating for the most marginalized person in that discussion. But like when we're having this discussion or when we're trying to navigate or when we're trying to find solution, I think one thing that's really important is to be flexible, to know that there's maybe more than one solution and never to like have a rigid stance to stay by, to say that we've always done this and that's why we have to stick by this rule. For example, like, you know, when we're thinking about field trips for earth sciences, you know, there's usually a certain time of the year or a certain place they would go, but when you're realizing that certain areas may not be safe for certain communities, or it may not be good for certain communities to be able to travel at that time of the year, being open that maybe you can move when the field trip happens because maybe everybody in that cohort is able to shift where they go, when they go. I think flexibility is one thing that's really important. So yeah, those are some of the ways I try to navigate intersectionality.
Yeah, no, definitely agree. And I think that some of those points we've actually raised them offline. So it's interesting for you to sort of bring those up in this discussion. James, would you like to comment on that?
When it comes to looking at the minority groups that you have within your own company, I think what's really important and something that I think the groups that I've been part of previously are somewhat guilty of are not collaborating together. And I think the only kind of collaboration that we do with our groups is we will turn around and say, well, we've got a particular thing on this week, so we need to make sure that we don't cross over. So, for example, when it comes to Bisexual Awareness Week, the LGBTQ plus working group will be able to have that week. But then, for example, if we're looking at disability awareness, then they're not as engaged. And it's like, how can we go beyond just that and make sure that we're actually putting our energy in it together?
Shipangi, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I very much agree with the concept that we need to be flexible about how inclusion works. And I suppose to that effect, I probably don't agree with the fact that, you know, we advocate for the most marginalized, because the notion of the most marginalized is a value judgment that each of us make with each of our own biases. And it implies that, you know, say your life changes, say you become disabled in a certain way. Does that now make you the most marginalized person? Have you finally won identity politics top trumps? And, you know, are you now playing into this framework of, I guess, even, you know, whether that's medicalized worthiness in a sense, like, you know, what we talk about with like trans identities and trans medicalization or disabled people or whatever. Do you actually have to be, I guess, you know, the most worthy or the least well off to deserve inclusion and to deserve a say? And is that identity something that will always stay a constant, which I certainly, like, you know, it's not been my lived experience that it is. It's certainly been my lived experience that, you know, we find out things about ourselves over a lifetime.
Yeah.
And even, I suppose, even in terms of naming identities, you know, we may know that we are something forever. Like, I've always known there's been something messed up with my joints, for example, but it's, am I suddenly more worthy now that that has a name? I don't think so. So I guess the value metric on how we do that needs to be thought about carefully. And I absolutely agree, James, like, our identities are also not inherently separate from each other. And so creating space in, I guess, DEI context, but also more widely, you know, outside of your PR and HR for your lab, for your workplace, for your company is so important, because otherwise you have, you know, disability days or LGBT days or whatever, which don't intersect. And those communities don't actually foster interlinking bonds, even though it's quite likely that those communities actually have a lot of people in common and have a lot of stories in common.
Exactly.
So that's really important to me.
I think that's, to kind of follow up on that point, this is something where I feel that sometimes when people talk about intersectionality, they only talk about it from the perspective of only two groups intersecting. So I feel that sometimes the problem with only thinking of it in such a binary way, which is really weird discussing binary on this particular call, is that it kind of limits the scope in which you're able to actually ensure that you are being inclusive of all of those people in all of those spaces. And that's something that we need to start shifting our way in which we think about intersectionality as what are our privileges and what are our sort of like disadvantages within life. So when I say that, and I know I've probably phrased it really poorly, I talk about the fact that I have the privilege that I'm a cis man. So I know that I can navigate space a lot better because of that. And having that awareness then also allows me to basically know when to shut up and listen. And I think that is sort of where the conversation should be heading. And I do think that we are getting there. But again, it's one of those things that sort of, I guess, it will come with time. But I think that's also because of what people still don't even aren't aware of what intersectionality is. But before I carry on with the discussion, I just also want to introduce our final guest, Claudia. So Claudia, could you just give like a 1 minute like introduction about yourself, please?
Hi, everyone, and sorry for joining a bit later, but this is a STEM panel, so my internet decided not to work because that's just what happens. My name's Claudia. I'm an astrophysicist and science communicator, and I identify as asexual.
Thank you, Claudia. So, which kind of brings us on to our next bit of the discussion. So far we've discussed about the importance of intersectionality, the fact that actually it's a very complicated topic to try and summarize in 10 minutes, but it's something that we need to be thinking about a lot more, and also knowing when to sort of use our voices in particular spaces. But one of the common themes that came through quite a few of the conversations that I had with you all was this idea of role models, and more specifically, why having role models is critical to improve overall representation. So my question, and Avery, I would actually like to hear your thoughts on this, is what do you think STEM is doing wrong to deter these individuals to engage within these spaces?
I think STEM has a real issue with the fact that a lot of the people who are senior in STEM and should be kind of encouraging, some of them have this feeling that STEM is very hard and STEM should be hard. And it should be hard for everyone because they suffered, and maybe some of them don't quite realize that just because something is hard doesn't mean you should then make it hard for the people following in on your footsteps, which is a big issue because STEM is hard, but that doesn't mean we should make it hard on top of other identities as well. And also there's this thing about being a trailblazer. Being a trailblazer is hard. So being the first to be a role model is also hard. And that means that there maybe is not role models to then follow, because if you then have to be the first, sometimes it's very hard to be the first and you don't want to be the first. And so that becomes an issue with then role models for our future going forward about finding. So it's not just even about that existing currently, it's about making sure we have new ones.
Yeah. And Rob, I know that in our chat, you spoke about this idea of being the first asexual person within the line of work that you do, that you're all aware of, which consequently means that when it comes to your future progression, that may potentially hinder it. I guess I wanted to know, have you had any additional thoughts on this idea of what could be, I guess, stopping asexual people wanting to go into the spaces that you work in?
Well, I think, and as we discussed on the Asexual podcast, STEM, and I think particularly engineering, is very male dominated, and what comes with that is, you know, discussions about your relationships, which I don't think most people want to talk about, regardless of how they identify. But that puts a particular alienation on asexual people who really do not want to talk about this stuff, because they don't want people to know that they're not into it. And also, it's kind of hard for me, being the only ace person in my business, that the other queer person on our committee is lesbian. So we only have two identities, and I'm almost complete opposite of her. And no one understands my perspective because no one else is ace. So it's really hard to try and explain these things to, heterosexual people.
No.
Yeah.
Definitely agreed. Sarah, so I'm also interested to know your thoughts on this, because actually we spoke about, so for context, Sarah and I talk a lot offline. And one of the things that we talk about is this idea of how sometimes we can be very quick to put a lot of pressure on role models. Can you give me some of your thoughts on that? Because I thought the audience would be very interested to know about this.
There can be this feeling of getting things right, and when you might be, let's say, one of the few ace people, let's say someone follows on Twitter, that I represent the entirety of the ace community. But the other pressure is that to be a role model, you have to also be out, and that is not an option for everyone from a safety perspective. But also, you shouldn't have to come out either. It's just a thing that we seem to have to do. And in order to be valid in our identities, there's this feeling of, I need to be out in order to be valid. And that's not true either. You're not any less ace or any other identity by not being out. So that is something I kind of think about. But the other thing so I feel that role models are important, and I think that visibility is important. But just to anyone who feels like, I need to be a role model, you don't owe anyone representation.
Exactly.
And just to say it very bluntly, and your number one priority is you being in your field and doing your job. When we talk about people being inspirational, there can be inspirational people, but something I think about quite a bit is, for that person, they just wanted to do their job. Did they actually want to be inspirational? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, definitely agreed. And Claudio, do you have any other following thoughts on that? Because again, we spoke about this offline. I think it was in regards to something completely different, but I feel like you mirror some of the very similar points that Sarah has.
I've actually felt very conflicted within my own journey about the idea of coming out or not, just because it so happened that my persona has become fairly public, and I wondered, am I not doing the right thing by staying in the closet? Because I could provide so much more inspiration to young queer people by giving them a visible role model that also identifies in a similar journey that they're having. And I felt very guilty for not being ready, but it wasn't my fault. I have chosen to occupy that space now. It's a choice that I took with my own time, on my own terms. I started planning to come out since last year, and I did it for a year. which is a long time to come to terms with the fact that you actually want to do it. But I did it on my own time, and I decided it was the right thing to do for me. I didn't do it because I owed anyone. If anything, I did it because I owed myself.
Yeah.
So that, I think that's the most important thing. And the other point I really wanted to quickly touch on is that they say a lot of this kind of thing about people wanted to get women in STEM. Oh, but you should be a role model for young girls out there. Like, sure. Okay, fair enough. I want as many young girls as possible to enjoy a career in STEM if that's what they want to. But also, I don't owe the industry to diversify it. I don't owe to be hyper visible and subject to threats and subject to discrimination and subject to victimization for all the issues that I will highlight. Added together with the range of identities that I already face discrimination for.
Exactly.
Nope, not here. So I'm all for role models, but I'm for role models that have to be supported by other institutions for their visible and invisible identities. I'm not going to be the poster child for diversity and for all the good and fantastic things that we're there for, unless institutions seriously protect me from retaliation, discrimination, victimization, and actually do the work that is needed. Because you don't deserve diversity if you don't practice inclusion. And just putting those 5 people, always the same 5 people at the forefront of your PR is not inclusion. You're just putting me at much higher risk of discrimination, and I'm not falling for it. I want to see change. That's not how you see change, just how you see a nicer leaflet.
It's really weird because you actually hit quite a few raw nerves as you were talking about that. Some of you may be aware that I have been seen as the poster child for a lot of academic institutions, because not only am I one of the only Black people usually in these spaces, but I'm definitely one of the only Black queer people in a lot of spaces that I sort of navigate, which then means that I end up basically being found to be asked, oh, you need to do a lot of your EDI work during your work time, which then means that when it comes to then me wanting to then go for promotions and stuff, I am then slightly behind the curve to all my other colleagues, because whilst they've been able to just get on with science, I've basically been made the poster boy of all of these things, the champion of all of the Black queer folk in like science. And it can be really exhausting. And I think that one of the things that I really want to have come out of this conversation is that if you are looking to have role models come into your institution, 1, ensure that they are being protected. 2, don't feel that just because they fall into a marginalized community, then that then means that they want to be a role model. Sometimes people just want to do science for the sake of science. And I'm saying science in the sort of generic STEM term. But just let people live their lives, let people earn their coin, let people have their things. And I think the final thing that I also want to kind of pick out at this point as well is that if you are going to want to actually say, okay, we would like you to be a role model for this, or we would like you to be a role model for that, let that actually account for the same accreditation if you are going for a promotion. So allow for so I know some institutions, for example, that will take EDI work into the promotions criteria. See if your workplace will allow to do that. And if you are at a point where you don't feel like you've got the power, carry on talking and carry on being in a position where you are actually being able to do it. And if you can't do that, compensate people for their emotional labor, because it's exhausting basically being asked to do all of these things whilst at the same time, getting, oh, don't worry, you get exposure. You found me, that is the exposure. So therefore, pay me for my things, pay me my coin. So we're coming up with some really interesting discussion points. And Shubhangi, actually, I'm going to ask your viewpoints on this. So when we were speaking, we spoke about the need for inclusive language, and we went into quite a bit of detail. I guess what I want to ask you is, what are the steps required for people to get better at doing this? And what are the best ways for people to own their mistakes when they make them, for example?
So I think, I mean, this is actually very important because I suppose I work in a very public facing role and I can see
Mm,
literally anybody come across my door at any point. And I suppose there's steps at which people who are within marginalized communities can get better and steps at which people who are outside of them can get better.
hmm
Thinking about people within the communities first, I guess some of the things that we see have to do with appeals to authority and the
hmm
generational gap of understanding and the generational gap at which rates of identities are evolving.
Yeah.
So, you have influencers now who were only able to be safe and only able to become publicly known because they appealed to authority. They, to some extent, courted legitimacy from people who
Mm,
very much want to box in identities. So to
hmm
them, like being disabled means physical disability, or being queer means being a certain kind of gay or trans or whatever.
Yeah.
And I suppose within the community, part of being inclusive in our language is being accepting of the fact that people who come after us, or even people who are, coming up around us from different cultures, have a very different understanding of what words mean. Like, with the best will in the world, I talk to people a lot of the time who do not understand what a slur is. Like their
Mm,
vernacular has never included the concept of a slur, or their vernacular has never included the understanding of what transness is.
mm,
And to them, it is in some way our, not necessarily duty, but something that behooves us in terms of fostering a community, that we
hmm
bring in those people and those experiences as well, in a sense that is genuine and open and educational,
Yeah.
while understanding that emotional labor and hearing slurs and the trauma it triggers is not obviously something that you need to put up with. And then I suppose from the other side, and I think that I think counters some degree of the making mistakes when people are actively trying, because the more you factor that into your decision metric about whether people are getting things right or wrong, the more giving you are of your time and your compassion, and
Yeah.
the more like you're willing to take it on good faith. But equally, then I guess in terms of persuading, I guess your employers or institutions at large, whatever form they might take, to
hmm
be more aware, I think to some degree it requires ingraining in that culture that just because somebody says they are a certain identity doesn't mean that
Yeah.
like every stereotype about them is a given, and doesn't mean that every stereotype about them needs to be rehashed. So just because somebody comes and says, I'm disabled, the next question shouldn't be, oh yeah, but where, like, oh my god, yeah, we're getting a ramp tomorrow, isn't it great? Or just because somebody
Yeah.
says they're from the LGBT community and whatever reason, that stereotypes aren't imparted. And I know that this happens in the social setting quite a lot between different groups. Like people
Mm,
have certain views about gay men and how, like, say, straight women intersect with gay men and gay culture, for example. Some of this is implicit, some of this is very much explicit. Much like it would be an incredible faux pas and actually probably illegal at this point to ask women, when are you having kids? And yet that's a really common barrier to access for surgery and postgraduate medical training.
yeah.
In the same way, not making the presumptions and not framing every individual you see by a broad prejudice you have about somebody.
Yeah. I
That's
think for
really
me,
important.
it's interesting because like I remember when somebody, so I used to be friends with somebody years ago who the only topics that she would ever want to talk to me about would be clothes, boys that she fancied, and shoes, which, if you know me personally, I don't have the best fashion sense in the world. I don't particularly like talking about shoes. And don't get me wrong, boys are great, but I don't need to talk about it 24 hours a day. And the reason I bring this up is because for me, it was just one of those points where I was like, you are only seeing me for this one identity. And then I do wonder, had I not mentioned this aspect of my identity, would you then be more willing to actually then go, oh yeah, I want to get to know Craig as a person. Oh, and here is something else about him. And I think this is something that I personally have now become a lot more, I guess, cautious with when it comes to the use of language and actually seeing whether people are trying. Claudia, what are your thoughts on that?
Um, when I am someone that really, really tries to keep up and educate myself on inclusive language in every single sphere. And it has happened a couple of times that people would think to come to me and ask for advice, like, oh, because I know that you do it a lot. Can you
Hmm.
help me phrasing this, and so on and so forth? And I feel like if you are in that place that you want to get it right,
Mhm.
we will see that there is good faith.
Yes.
Clearly, there are some common pitfalls that you can avoid falling in by, keeping on that open-mindedness and keep educating yourself. But if you're coming from a good place, 9 out of 10 people will see it. There is this sort of common fear that everyone is out to get you. We're not, our experiences might not be sort of mainstream, but we're not ready to be offended at any single word you say.
Yeah.
If you say or do something that doesn't make us feel at ease, or that I think, as an ally to other communities, that I might think they might not make members of that community feel at ease, I will generally point out, hey, look, I just thought that that point could have been phrased differently, but I'm not going to think less of you necessarily. I'm not going to think that you're a bad, evil person. You are trying, and you have to accept that you may get it wrong. So I feel like the best way to make mistakes is accept that you are going to make mistakes. It's uncomfortable. No one likes making mistakes, okay? I certainly don't, but I know I'm going to make them. And by accepting that, I can be a better ally, I can be a better supporter, and I can be a better member of the community myself.
Yeah.
So that you will make mistakes and try to do better. And that can be by keep reading from, what other people have written, or active listening to members of that marginalized communities, but also don't just go to your queer friend for advice on how to be a better ally, because it's not their job to constantly be educating
That's the main thing.
you.
Yeah. No,
but also just keep being active in this journey, and we will see who are the people that come to this in good faith, and who are the people that are just trying to gotcha.
Yeah. So for me, it's like, so some of you are aware that I bake, and within that, in the way that taught me the idea of being able to make mistakes and then go, okay, how can I sort of improve on that recipe? And I've kind of taken that approach, especially when it comes to me not only being part of the LGBTQ plus community, but in addition to that as well, ensuring that I am willing to make mistakes when I'm trying to actively learn myself. And it is okay to feel uncomfortable. I think for me, it's one of those things when I will hear from some people that they're scared of approaching people because they're worried, oh, if I say something slightly out of line, then this person's gonna like shut me down and it's all gonna be like game over and stuff. And I always say that actually the majority of people don't think like that. And a lot of people are willing to actually be accepting of you making mistakes if you are actually making an effort. And for me, I find I come across more people who are actively trying to learn. And if I hear that they get the language wrong ever so slightly, but the general like conceptualness of what they're trying to say is decent, then I'm more willing to actually engage. Mostly because I'm all about accessibility of language and I don't like language being a barrier. But that's this is a different podcast series for another day. James, what are your thoughts about this? And I say this because we've spoken about this offline again. I've had a lot of offline discussions, okay? I'm a busy person.
It's fine, Craig. We know you like a chin wag. Don't worry about it. It's fine. I personally think that we need to make sure that we remove gender from the discussion around roles in work, because I think a lot of the time we say, and I don't know if tech is more guilty of this than other industries, but for example, we will have, as a software engineer, he will do this. As a PA, she will do that. And it's like, why are we assigning a gender to a role? Because it feels in a way that we're delegitimizing the fact that a woman is a software engineer. Like, it's almost like she's going to say, am I not meant to be here because you keep saying that a man is suitable for this role? And I just find that it happens a lot. And when you politely correct someone, you can see that they didn't mean it at all. Do you know what I mean? They didn't mean to be sort of gendering a role, but they feel really quite awkward about it.
Yeah.
And I think around the kind of the question side of things, I think what's really important is to kind of remove the vernacular of stupid questions, because there are no stupid questions that aren't just questions to be asked. In private, people then turn around to me and say, well, I would really like to ask a question, but I just feel like I'm going to be spoken down to or treated as stupid. And I can't remember who it was, but someone made the point, it's like, yeah, people might be ignorant, but allow them to ask the ignorant questions, or what may seem to be ignorant, because at least they're trying, at least they're engaging, and they're wanting to educate themselves. Exactly. And, you know, working in a sector that is very male sort of dominated, I would always encourage people to ask me questions, whether or not that's privately or publicly. Obviously, I would rather it be publicly, because then others can learn from the knowledge that you're trying to share. But at the same time, it's like, even if one person wants to ask you privately, it's like that's one more person who is feeling better off. And actually, you would be surprised. Well, probably not actually, but the way in which they respond in terms of, I'm super grateful that you took the time to explain that to me, and you didn't just kind of go, well, that's stupid, isn't it? You know, so it's like, actually, people aren't really willing to engage. My other final point was just to be, we all have pronouns in our titles, but I don't think we really explain to people, Craig, but we don't we never really explain as to why. And I think as well, it's really important that it's really small, simple gesture around inclusivity. And I think if people understood that it really didn't take a lot of effort, but it actually means a lot to some people. You know, I've worked in places where we've put pronouns into bios and people then have felt comfortable to come out as non-binary or trans. And I personally think that's wonderful. It's just a small act, therefore encourages people because they realize they are in a safe space.
Yeah. And also, just because you have terminology, so I came across a term that I didn't know about. I did my research, couldn't find any articles, did more research, still couldn't find any articles. So I ended up asking the person who I'm friends with why they use that terminology. And I told them all the work I did before. And they were like, the fact that you've gone through all of that work to get to this point, I'm okay to have that discussion with you. Because like at the end of the day, people don't owe your emotional labor to you. But if you are actively trying, then most of the time, provided you've put the work in, people are willing to kind of help. Does that? Have you got any thoughts on that?
I agree with everyone that you can pretty much pick up who has the good intention or comes from the best intention, and who's trying to learn and be better. Because usually what happens is like when it's a new person and they make a mistake, I'm always quite forgiving, and I will try to like take my time to explain. And if I see that they're willing to learn and like, you know, adjust and become better, then, you know, it's not like all is forgiven. It's more that you're learning. But if I see that they're being hostile and they're like really, you know, they're really resisting, or they're defending, or they're not listening, or they're not seeing like why you're hurt, then that's a whole different predicament on its own. But I think one thing that we haven't really talked about is that language is constantly evolving, particularly related to the context, to events. Like there's a lot of, I think, particularly around race and ethnicity, language has evolved a lot. And a lot of it has to do with, you know, a lot of the racist incidents or like racial relationships that have evolved in society. So one thing that we're always needing to be aware that language does evolve over time. So on one hand, we have to be aware that maybe people aren't aware of how the language has adjusted, but on the other side, allies and those who don't identify have to be aware that, you know, language is adjusting and changing, and that they also have to learn to adjust and modify the language to whatever makes the community feel safe.
Exactly. I think that's an interesting point. So, side note, my auntie did a master's in inclusion in education a few years ago. And part of that, she actually spoke about what she identifies as. And it's the fact that she uses the term Afro Caribbean as opposed to Black, because for her, it makes her identity feel as though like it's valid. And I spoke to her about this because I identify as Black British mostly because I come from both I'm both Ghanaian and Jamaican, and there was a point in which I never felt that I fitted into just one exclusive group. I always felt that I was sort of like in the middle, and Black British was the point where I was like, I feel comfortable about this. And going back to this idea of evolving language, it's ensuring that not only do people feel that they can be safe to talk about these topics and discuss these points, but also that the community around them won't, for example, go, you can't say that, or that's not what it's like. Because I've had some people say that to me where I would say I identify as X and they go, well, actually, the language is blah, 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 blah. And in most times I go, as somebody who's not a part of that group, you then don't have the right to then try to then dictate how I utilize language. So that's on you and not on me. And you need to check your privilege. So that is sort of like my 2-minute rant, if we're going to call it that, on that. So we've had a really nice discussion. And again, thank you for everybody for joining me on this. And because I feel as though people who are watching this and listening to this are going to come away and go, oh, I didn't think about that. Oh, actually, I can reenact this very small change and then kind of pass it on to what I'm sort of doing. So we're going to just sort of like cover like the last topic, which is this idea of putting your money where your mouth is. So we talk about this idea of emotional labor. We talk about this idea that we usually asked to do a lot of these things for free. And it shouldn't be down to the marginalized group to be spearheading these movements when they're not going to be given their accolades and their coin afterwards. So Shipangi, what do you think organizations can do that do it right? And what are examples of when they get it completely wrong?
So I've written about this topic both in science and medicine and journalism, well, in all of those. And I find that what they actually probably do wrong, and a lot of what EDI in terms of visibility gets very wrong, personally, is the fact that a lot of the money goes into, like, putting your money where your mouth is. And it goes into PR initiatives, and it goes into like bus adverts, and it goes into, making even shinier boxes for people to be in. It makes lots of closed spaces, but it doesn't really go any further than putting it where their mouth is. I think that's a big challenge. And I think, like, this is something that I actually want to make very clear. I think that's actually something that's harmed queer communities disproportionately in the pandemic, because a lot of ways in which they've been able to access community has solely been through corporatized spaces. It's solely been through corporate censored spaces like social media or like news outlets, a load of which are flagrantly transphobic, a load of which like very openly censor queer conversations and communities and don't let you build them outside of what can be consumed. So I think that a lot of the challenges that come from expecting inclusion in any institution is this idea of saying, put your money where your mouth is, because they'll just be like, sure, we've done that. Okay, bye now. But I think what people can do that is very useful is to work in terms of reimbursing and supporting people in a longitudinal sense.
Exactly.
So one of my roles at the moment is a race and ethnicity advisor to the Maudsley Biomedical Research Center. And part of our work has this multi-tiered approach where, we're a group of people from all walks of life who come and advise people on not just race and ethnicity issues, but a lot of different inclusion issues in research. And it has this tiered approach where we acknowledge that the people who are coming in to advise, some of them will be a lot better off. Their social standing is met with financing longitudinally, like they have grants and stuff. They can afford to say no to payment, but that there is payment there on a rolling basis that is codified and offered to you every time you do a piece of work. And that, you never have to feel like you have to go back and ask for it. That rate is set, and it's something that you agree to initially. and you can always choose to apply or not apply for the funding you deserve.
Yeah.
I feel like open spaces like that with an open pot of money that is transparently available and it's available at set rates for your time for certain tasks you do, whether they're in person or remote or digital or not. I think that's really good. I think knowing on an ongoing basis that somebody is making a commitment to giving you funding to help you train, to help you make that time, to help you, you know, not think of this whole idea of making, like, you know, getting your coin as an avaricious thing, even though if it is, like, who the hell cares? We're all paid way less than we should be. Decoupling it from seeing it as an avaricious thing, or, you know, decoupling activism from just constantly being voluntary when it's done off the backs of marginalized people. I think that's a really good model for starting to work, as well as what you said about, you know, accrediting the work we do on a par with the other, I guess, academic outputs or business outputs that other people have.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I really liked about what you've just said is this idea of longitudinal work. So it can't just be we're going to be funding a one-day event and then basically be like, oh my God, we fixed all the problems and you end up here anything else for 12 months. It needs to be committed change. And especially this is really important when it comes to trying to engage people within spaces that are, for example, inherently white. So as an example, if you are trying to say, oh, we need to engage the BME community, firstly, it's not engage the BME community, pump money into it, because you will find that a lot of the times I won't apply for programs because I know it's inherently white. You need to actually give me a reason as to why I want to engage in these spaces. And I've also heard this, especially when it comes to people who are disabled, as well as people within the trans community, where if you've got spaces that are inherently transphobic or inherently ableist, then they're not going to engage. And you need to actually make a committed change to actually kind of carry on from that. Avery and Rob, so both of you kind of raised these as points actually in previous discussions. Would you like to give some like feedback on that, I guess? Avery, then Rob afterwards.
Yeah, I would add to that. I always joke a lot about rainbow capitalism, but whole like organizations, for example, seeming to forget that minorities exist apart from like Pride Month, for example. Having that chance to reflect on what you're actually doing this for. Is it just for external outwardness, not embedded it? What have you really spent that money for? But additionally, I guess another thing to not do is don't think that paying for one person can fix anything. One person is an expert in everything, and it becomes harmful for other identities. Because I've seen it in EDI committees, for example, where one person is considered the leading EDI expert because, for example, the university spent money on them, so we need to get everything out of them. And then it becomes harmful because people, then minorities speaking up, then get shut down because we're not spent money on you, so what does your opinion matter? The balance of it always then being on that person, even if you pay for them, is harmful for them as well. I mean, part of the reason I had such a hard time, for example, coming out as a transgender man, is I felt that I had to be this role model for women in STEM. Sorry, coming back to role models, but yeah. But then I was somehow letting people down by being not. And it was only when somebody to me was like, oh, I'm sure there's actually less transgender, for example, people in STEM than women. So you could still be a good role model. It's also partly ridiculous that I felt such a strong need to be a role model. But again, with this one person always being a person, even if they're paid for, it's like, for example, even now I get asked a lot about women in STEM, and it feels harmful for me because I can't fix everything, even if you give me funding to do so. And it's quite dysphoria triggering, for example, for me to be asked, what about women in STEM? Because I'm like, what, do you not see me as a man in STEM? I can't speak for women in STEM.
Yeah, and just before I bring Rob's point into that, I just wanted to kind of clarify that one person within one marginalized community does not speak for every person. So I do not speak for all Black queer folk. I'm just putting that out there. I've made that very clear, and now I'm saying it again on record, okay? And I say this because it's also understanding your own privilege. If you know there are people, and this is sort of like aimed, and this is sort of like a PSA to all of those people who get those really paid positions and feel like they need to be the only person at the table. If you know somebody that is more qualified than you to do that particular gig, pass their name onto the organization. So I've had plenty of time where I've been asked to do things, but I actually know somebody who is more specialist or more qualified to talk about that very specific thing. So I just go, actually, I can't do this, but I know somebody else who can do this. And also it's this idea of ensuring that you're not the one basically platforming this entire space. Like at the end of the day, the more voices that we have, the better it will be, because diversity of opinion results in a better outcome. Sorry, Rob, I just kind of interrupted you halfway through there, but I just wanted to clarify at one point before it left my mind.
That's all right. I mean, my point, I kind of want to go back to the whole EDI thing and always putting the onus for an identity on the person who identifies with it, which has the effect of pushing away allies. So, for example, I joined the EDI committee at my business before I knew I was ACE. But it took a while to join it because it was always ethnic minorities there, or queer people or disabled people there. There wasn't really any place for someone who has privileges. And there was really, but it gave the impression that there wasn't that, and it had to be anyone from these minorities to do that job, which is wrong. But allies have a different perspective. They can bridge that gap between what a minority sees and what everyone who isn't a minority in whatever area sees. And they have the language to be able to voice the opinions of minorities to people who don't understand the language that minorities are speaking, which I think is important to push. And we've started doing that a little bit at our company, but we still need to work on it.
Yeah.
And it's something I'm pushing for in our EDI community.
Yeah, I think that is a very nice point, actually, because I always say that sometimes whenever I want to get certain points put forward, I say that I get my white friends to talk about it because they can do their white people talk to other white people, and white people do their whiting, and that's all I need to say on that. But I also say that in the sense that it's all about this idea of once you know what your privileges are, you can also have access to spaces that other people may not have access to. So if you are, for example, an ally that is actively doing the work and actually trying to go, no, I'm understanding my privilege, and I'm also ensuring that I'm bringing people into those spaces, then that's something that, again, it then takes the pressure of marginalized communities to always be the spearheaders rather of the work that we're trying to do. Sarah, have you got any comments on that?
I was just thinking about the question of people putting their money where their mouth is, thinking about organizations. I think there's been a lot of really great points so far. So the PR exercise, I was kind of, this is what I feel is that organizations can do very light touch kind of work and not thinking about that long-term work. So I think that's a really good point. A couple of things I was just thinking about is I think it's really important to support organizations who work with these communities. So for example, Pride in STEM, support people like them, for example. The other thing is remembering that if, let's say, so I've worked on a girls in physics project, not make sure that we have girls as cis, white, just remember that girls are more than just girls, kind of just thinking about our earlier conversation with intersectionality. So remember that if we are working with certain communities, it's not having like these, what we would say, as I'm going to put it in air quotes, it's sort of standard model. This is what we expect, if that makes sense. Finally, something organizations do need to think about is also who we give recognition to. I'm not going to name the organization, but I'm sure many people will know who exactly I'm talking about. But a well-known organization has given an award to somebody who's known to be a transphobe. What kind of message does that send to people that you supposedly support?
Exactly. And I think that is when said organization did that particular action, the thing that really saddened me is what happens if, for example, you were to be in a position where you've won an award from said organization and you've then seen that they've awarded that in itself is dangerous and very harmful. And I think it's one of those things that if you're an organization, not only should you ensure that you are working with communities and organizations such as Pride in STEM, which again, thank you Pride in STEM for hosting me to do this podcast series. But also, like, if you mess up, make sure that you're accountable and don't do it again. Like, there's no neat way to say that. So yeah. But I am going to do the executive decision to stop the discussion there, only because we are coming to the end of this podcast series and some of our guests have to go in a bit. But before I begin, I would just like to say a massive thank you to every single person who's basically like partaken in this series. It's been an absolute pleasure for me to have these conversations with you. But in addition to that as well, like, for me to just hear your stories and expertise, because I do think that storytelling is still a very powerful form of giving that expertise. And what I hope that for everybody who's listened to this is that you've basically been able to take away some really valid points, and hope that you become like better allies and better people going forward. So I would also like to thank Pride in STEM for providing us this platform for us to be able to do this project. And again, thank you to all our panelists for this discussion. This has been me, Craig Poku. It's been a pleasure to be able to host this. And again, see you on the other side. So cheers.